there is something deeply wrong with the official story of how modern grief began. If you go back far enough, not decades, but centuries, you find a world that treated death differently, not with fear, not with clinical detachment, with something older, something architectural, something encoded into stone and ritual and music and fabric and light in ways that we have almost entirely forgotten. And then, right around 1915, something happened. Not gradually, not slowly. The old mourning culture, the elaborate, universal, deeply human practice of grieving the dead in ways that took months and sometimes years, collapsed. The records were reclassified, the traditions were pathologized, the physical spaces that held the grief were demolished or repurposed. And within a single generation, human beings were told that prolonged grief was a mental disorder, that elaborate funeral rites were superstition, and that the appropriate response to the death of a loved one was to move on quickly, efficiently, and quietly. Tonight we are reading the old records, and the old records tell a very different story. If this kind of buried history speaks to you, if you feel somewhere in your bones that something was taken from you that you cannot quite name, then stay with this channel. Every video here is built from the records they stopped teaching. Subscribe, press the bell, and let us keep reading together. Before 1915, grief was a public infrastructure. That is not a metaphor. It was literally built into the streets, the buildings, the trade routes, the postal systems, and the textile economies of every culture on Earth. In the English-speaking world alone, the Victorian mourning system, which was not an eccentricity of one culture, but a reflection of something far older and more universal, required that a widow wear full black mourning dress for a minimum of 2.5 years after the death of her husband. The fabric had to be a specific non-reflective crepe, because light was not appropriate in the presence of death. After the first year, she could add a small amount of white at the collar. After 2 years, she could gradually lighten the palette. The entire transition was called half mourning, and it had its own colours, grey, lavender, mauve, because the passage from deep grief back into ordinary life was understood to be a gradual thing, a slow return, not a sudden switch that you flipped 6 weeks after the burial. This was not confined to England. France had its own mourning protocols maintained in handbooks printed by the thousands. Germany had mourning jewelry industries so elaborate that entire towns survived on their production. Japan had mourning periods embedded in Buddhist and Shinto practice that governed dress, diet, social behavior, and household arrangement for months after a death. The Ottoman world had mourning rituals written into civil law. Indigenous cultures across every continent had mourning periods that were tracked by the community, enforced socially, and supported with specific foods, specific songs, specific architectural arrangements of the home. What all of these systems had in common, across cultures that had no contact with each other, was the understanding that grief required time, required witness, and required the body to move through something rather than over it. And then they told us that was wrong. Here is the thing about the records. When you go into the archives and you look at the medical literature before 1915, grief is not classified as a pathology. It is described as a natural process with predictable stages, requiring community support and adequate duration. The word for someone who was still visibly grieving a year after a death was not disturbed. It was bereaved. It was faithful. In some traditions, it was even sacred. After 1915, that language began to change. The first psychiatric frameworks that reclassified prolonged grief as a disorder began appearing in medical journals between 1917 and 1923. The timing is not coincidental. The First World War had produced a death toll so massive, somewhere between 17 and 20 million people killed in 4 years, that if the old mourning culture had been allowed to continue at its previous scale, entire economies would have ground to a halt. You cannot run an industrial supply chain if half your workforce is in 2-year mourning dress. You cannot maintain military enlistment if young men are publicly grieving the deaths of their brothers for 18 months. The economic and military incentive to compress grief, to privatize it, To pathologize its longer expressions was enormous, and the institutions that were building the new modern world, governments, pharmaceutical companies, the emerging psychiatric profession, had every reason to supply that compression. This is where the records become uncomfortable. In the years between 1915 and 1930, the mourning textile industry in England collapsed by over 80%, not because people stopped dying, because the social permission to grieve visibly was quietly, systematically withdrawn. The black crepe manufacturers tried to adapt. There are trade journals from 1921 that read almost desperately, arguing that the traditions should continue, that the culture was making a terrible mistake. Those journals are very hard to find today. Most of them were not digitized. Several of the archives that held them were consolidated or closed between 1970 and 1990, during a period when the management of physical historical collections was being centralized and, in many cases, quietly pruned. When you look at the funeral architecture of the pre-1915 world, something else becomes clear. The buildings that served grief were not peripheral, they were central. Every major city on earth had mourning halls, lying in chapels, public memorial reading rooms, mourning garden districts, physical spaces built specifically for the collective processing of loss. These were not simply cemeteries. The cemetery was the final destination. What came before it was an elaborate spatial journey through community grief, and it required buildings. Those buildings are almost entirely gone. In London alone, there were 14 dedicated public mourning halls operating in 1900. By 1940, there were 2. By 1970, there were none. Their demolition records, where they survive at all, describe them as obsolete or economically unviable. What they do not explain is why, in cities that preserved Victorian train stations and Victorian courthouses and Victorian postal buildings as heritage sites, the buildings specifically associated with collective grief were so consistently allowed to disappear. The Tartarian record, and here is where the mainstream historians look away, suggests that the mourning architecture of the pre-1915 world was not simply a cultural preference, it was an inheritance. When you look at photographs of the great mourning halls and memorial gardens that existed before the First World War, you find the same architectural signatures that appear across what researchers call the Tartarian building canon. High domed ceilings with unusual acoustic properties, arched galleries that carry sound in ways modern buildings cannot replicate, stone carving traditions that include symbols found across cultures, with no documented contact, spatial arrangements that create specific effects of light at specific times of year. The grief spaces of the old world were built by people who understood something about sound and light and the human nervous system that we have been told was never formally known until the 20th century. That contradiction has never been satisfactorily explained. There is a practice described in records from across Europe, North Africa and Central Asia, records that predate 1800 by several centuries, involving the use of specific tonal frequencies in mourning ceremonies, not music as we understand it. Sustained tones produced by trained mourners that were maintained for hours at a time in the specific acoustic chambers of mourning halls. These practices are documented by travellers, by clergy, by civil administrators. They are described as producing physical effects in those who participated, a loosening, a release, a passage through grief that witnesses consistently described as different in quality from ordinary weeping. In the late 19th century, when grief was still understood as something that required passage rather than suppression, these practices were still alive in remote communities across multiple continents. After 1915, they disappeared almost simultaneously everywhere. The convergence of that disappearance is one of the strangest things in the historical record. When grief traditions vanish in one culture, you can usually trace it to a specific political event, a specific colonial disruption, a specific religious suppression. When grief traditions vanish across multiple cultures with no documented contact on the same approximate timeline, you are looking at something coordinated. and coordinated cultural change of that magnitude does not happen by accident. It requires institutions, it requires print, it requires the systematic replacement of one framework with another, and the framework that replaced the old mourning culture, the clinical, psychiatric, duration-limited model of grief that we now consider obvious and natural, appeared in the professional literature of the new global institutions at exactly the moment the old framework was being cleared away. Read the old records carefully, and you will find something else they do not tell you in the standard histories. The pre-1915 mourning culture was also a memory culture. The extended period of public grief was not only for the bereaved, it was for the community. The rituals that surrounded death, the specific foods prepared, the specific songs sung, the specific objects placed in the home, encoded information about the person who had died, about their lineage, about the history of the community, about agreements and relationships and knowledge that would otherwise be lost when an elder or a skilled person died. Mourning was, in its older form, a knowledge transfer system as much as an emotional one. You did not merely grieve the person, you received what they knew. The community gathered, and in the gathering the knowledge moved. When you compress grief into a 6-week window and pathologize anything longer, you do not only suppress emotion, you interrupt transmission, you break the chain, and a community whose knowledge transmission chain has been broken is a community that becomes dependent on external sources for its understanding of itself, on institutions, on approved texts, on certified experts, on the very structures that benefit most from the population not knowing what was known before. That is not a conspiracy. It is a mechanism, and mechanisms leave evidence. The evidence is in the old records, in the trade journals of the mourning textile industry, in the architectural surveys of demolished buildings, in the ethnographic reports of colonial administrators who documented grief practices in the communities they were simultaneously disrupting. In the private letters of early psychiatrists who acknowledged in correspondence that was not intended for publication that the compression of grief they were promoting was driven as much by social management as by clinical evidence. Some of those letters survive. They are in archives. They require time and patience, and the willingness to sit with very old handwriting in very quiet rooms. Most people do not have that time, which is, of course, part of the design. What was lost when the old mourning culture was erased is not merely a set of customs, it is a technology of passage. Every major spiritual tradition on earth before the 20th century understood that the movement through grief was a threshold experience, that the person who came out the other side of a properly witnessed, properly supported, properly extended period of mourning was not merely recovered, but transformed. Different in some essential way, more capable, more present, more connected to what was real. The mourning period was not a pause in life, it was a crucible, and what came out of it, if the conditions were right, was a person who had been in contact with something deep enough to change them permanently. We were told that this was superstition. We were told it was inefficiency. We were told that modern psychology had found better ways. And yet the rates of complicated grief, of unprocessed loss, of depression and disconnection, and the persistent sense that something essential is missing, those rates have done nothing but climb in the century since the old mourning culture was dismantled. The clinical model that replaced it has produced a population with very sophisticated language for grief and very little capacity to actually move through it. That is not a failure of the model. For those who benefit from a population stuck in perpetual unprocessed loss, dependent, medicated, searching for something it cannot name, it is a success. Read the old records. They are still there, if you know where to look. They are in the back rooms of regional archives, and in the footnotes of 19th century encyclopedias, and in the collections of institutions that have not yet finished the work of deciding what to preserve and what to allow to quietly disappear. They describe a world that understood death differently, a world that made room for grief on a scale we can barely imagine, a world whose mourning halls had acoustics that no modern building can replicate, and whose grief rituals encoded knowledge that has not been recovered. They erased it because a people who know how to grieve are a people who know how to remember. And a people who know how to remember are very difficult to tell what to think. If this kind of history matters to you, if you want to keep reading what was buried, this channel will keep digging, every week, quietly, carefully. The records are there, the story is there. We just have to be willing to sit with it long enough to let it speak.